Welcome to Food, Wine, and Whiskey, a podcast about having fun conversations on tasty dishes, vinos, and spirits from around the world. Rob is your host. He is an avid home chef, WSET Level 2 award in wine, and a whiskey drinker and collector. Time to set the table. Here's Rob.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you so much for stopping back in for another episode. We've got a really good show on tap for today. I've got a guest who's been a contributor to the show a few times, and I'm so glad to have him back on for this episode. Joining the show again is Kevin Day, editor-in-chief of the online publication, the magazine, Opening the Bottle. How are you, Kevin?
Great, Rob. How are you? Thank you again for having me on.
I'm really glad to have you on. I'm glad we're having this conversation because listeners who have listened to an episode I did a couple of weeks ago and put out, the big hype at the end of the year is all these top 100 wine lists came out. And if you listened to my episode a couple of weeks ago with my lovely wife, I did a bit of ranting on that list. And, I also kind of came to peace with it a little bit about, for me, not for everybody, but for me, of what that list is or how I should look at that list, view that list, maybe apply that list in my journey of wine. And it was almost more of just a fun exercise to just look at some of those wines. If I find them, do I just kind of try them and see if I think they qualified to be on the list where they were?
Well, I like it when you rant, Rob. I like that episode, and I think you embody what a lot of wine consumers, some of their frustrations with how things are presented to them. But at the same time, being also, someone who understands there's a business to be made out of writing about wine and doing a publication. There's a few things that, there's a few reasons why these lists exist, I guess I would say. Because I think you and I, as wine lovers, how do you pick a favorite wine throughout a whole year, right?
Yeah.
I think it's very subjective. And my wife would be the first one to say, that's really silly that you're even doing this. Like she's just, I'll ask her, what's like your favorite? She's like, let's not do that. I don't really do favorites. And so that's very valid. But I think right now, this time of year, there's a very intense interest in wine, for one. It's October, November, December. This is when the wine industry makes a lot of its sales because there's high interest with the holidays. And to go along with that, it makes smart business sense as a publication to offer up some guidance on what to buy, which is, I think, the reason why a lot of these WIT lists exist. I do my list very differently, which we'll talk about here in a second. But I think in that sense, it generates some enthusiasm. It gives you some talking points as a publication to talk about where you see the standards are and set the bar a little bit. And then from there, it's really up to the consumers to say whether or not it's useful, whether or not it's valid. But the wine industry still loves a good list. It still likes a good shelf talker. And for me, I think that reliance on lists, and here I am talking out both sides of my mouth as someone who creates a list, but I think that reliance on lists, on point scores, it really puts up a wall between people getting more and more comfortable with wine and feeling like they can own their own tastes. Because they feel like, I like that wine, but it wasn't 94 points,
Well, let's start with I'm a consumer. That's where I am in my.
And I am too.
Yeah. And so I couldn't tell you what a 94. You're in the profession, so to speak. I like talking about wine. You actually study and drink and evaluate and maybe grade. You have your system. I couldn't tell you what a 94-point wine would be. I could tell you this is really freaking good. I really like it. And I think that's where most consumers should start. Do you like the wine? Forget about the number. But getting back to the list, Kevin, I made my comment about the wine enthusiast, wine spectator top 100. Look, I like lists too. And that's why I'm so happy to have you on today because you have a list I can get behind. You have a list. I was excited to look at your list and your bottles and your kind of evaluation and thoughts on these things, because as a guy who loves exploring the world of wine, you're giving me a list that, it may be a bit of a challenge to find some of the bottles, but, once you kind of get that kill and you find that bottle, I think you're just going to be very much rewarded for making the effort to find that bottle.
I hope so. And I appreciate you saying that because I'm really thoughtful about this list. It takes me way too many hours to do.
Yeah.
But I think what you just said there, which is a key point, these wines are pretty hard to find. I mean, I'm pretty hard to please. And it takes a lot at this point in my career to make me kind of perk up and go, oh, this is really dramatic and different in the glass. And I'm going to remember this months from now at the end of the year when I'm doing my silly list. And so those wines they are a little bit hard to find, but I think the win here would be if that wine inspires some curiosity in you, the reader, to either look for that wine, look for that producer, or look for a wine from that wine region, right? There's a few wine regions that consistently show up on my list. Some of them are very well known. Some of them are a little bit more, maybe on the fringe a little bit. Some grape varieties will show up on my list from time to time. I try to get a little bit variety from year to year because to me, and this gets to the concept of my list, it's really about coming up with a small, diverse group of wines that really taught me quite a bit about my palate throughout the year and where I want to go in my journey next year. And I hope that inspires people who read this article and who follow Opening a Bottle and who read my work, that they feel like this is an invitation to do this work on their own, because in the end, that's how you achieve expertise, is you understand yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not doing this for anybody else, right? You're not trying to become a wine critic yourself and make a living out of it. You don't need to be doing point scores. You just need to be buying better wine because you understand your palate better, right? That's the hard work that goes into this as wine lovers, is making the notes, remembering producers, remembering grapes that are consistent for you, and then, taking that information and evolving as a drinker and finding new things and new sensations. I think that's really what it's all about.
Well, having said that, let's go back a little bit so the listeners kind of understand who you are if they haven't heard you on the show before, because you talked about your list. We might see a few grapes from particular regions, and that's by design, because tell everybody again, about Opening a Bottle,
Sure.
who you are, kind of what you specialize in, right? Because there's some regions that you specialize. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm very much focused on Italian wines. That is my specialty. That is my passion. And I have the most opportunities to travel to Italy. And I'm now on a circuit where I'm invited annually to the three big wine regions, Piedmont, Tuscany, and Sicily, to taste wines, to evaluate wines, to meet producers, to take photos, and tell stories. And that's what Opening a Bottle is really all about. Now, within that, I'm also certified for French wines, and I'm very familiar with French wines and really adore quite a few French wine regions. So I often do a lot of coverage of France. Austria continues to vie for my attention, so I keep putting Austrian wines into the site. And this upcoming year, I'm going to be taking a class on the Spanish wines through the Wine Scholar Guild. So I'm going to become a Spanish wine scholar by the end of the year, I'm hoping. And that will really open up the door for me to tell a deeper story there from a wine education standpoint. So Opening a Bottle is really focused on wine education and wine curiosity to start with. It's really focused in Europe because that's where my specialty is. I don't have anything against American wines, Latin American wines, New Zealand wines. It's just not where I concentrate my effort. And so I'm just out of my league, and I'll admit that. And I think more people should do that when it comes to wine. So yes, when I do my year-end list, there is a heavy emphasis on Italian wine, but Italy is so diverse and so enormous and so unknowable that, each year that list could be completely different. And I would also say that, the whole publication could be devoted to Italy, and I would never run out of stories. And nor would my readers ever find it dull. I would hope.
And I always talk, Kevin, Italy's my favorite country to drink wine from. I love exploring the globe for wine, but it's kind of hard once you get into Italy to leave, because what is it? Something like 300 different varieties of indigenous grapes that they have from north to south that you can drink.
20 different regions. And, when you study Italian wine, you learn that those 20 regions are basically 20 countries.
Yeah.
Val d'Aosta is partially French. You go down to Sicily, and they've got a strong Spanish history, but they also have a strong Arab history, and they also have a strong history from Greek influence. And so Sicily's like it's a completely different thing. So you take all those 20 regions, you take all these grapes, it's chaotic at first. It's overwhelming at first. And so hopefully, and that's partly as a wine educator, there's always fertile ground to help people make sense of this place, which is so wonderful and rich. So that's partly why the list is
well, and I'll tell you too, another region that I love in Italy that I discovered about, I don't know, a year and a half ago is Alto Adige. When you talk about this kind of cross-culture kind of influence into the
very
wine
Austrian.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I love Italy because it's, to your point, there's just so many different wines that you can drink from different grapes. But also, as a consumer, when I think about wines from the world, every country you go to, whether it's Australia, it's America, it's South Africa, it's always, and I'm not, it's fine. They have their style, they have their kind of, mark on that particular wine, that grape, but it's typically Chardonnay and it's typically Pinot Noir and Cabernet Sauvignon and Syrah and these kind of things, where Italy, it's just its own world of great grapes, which is what makes me love it so much, I guess.
Well, as I said earlier, I'm easily bored, right? I'm easily, it's hard to impress me sometimes because I have that mindset, and I'm never bored with Italy because it offers so much.
Yeah.
That's really what it comes down to. And I hopefully, like when I write my content, frequently I find myself falling into the trap of just telling tasting notes as if that's the story. And I have to go delete. That's not what this is about. What is it really like? So I think that's partly what fuels my writing, is a sense of like, let's not make this boring. Like if I'm writing about it, it better be interesting. So here's what's interesting about it. So that's really what ties into these 12 wines. So
when we jump into your list, anytime we're going to sit down and make a list, there has to be some criteria, things that are met for these wines, making the list.
Yep.
What can we go through and talk about kind of what your list was comprised of as far as criteria?
Yeah, well, the concept, the conceit of the list is I have a device for it. It's a mixed case. So
okay.
I used to do a top 100. I used to do a top 10. And then like a few years ago, I stumbled upon this idea of like, what if I were to just look at it not as what are the best wines from the year, but rather I'm in a great wine shop. It's got everything I've tasted this whole year, and I've got an unlimited, gift card.
Yeah.
And I can fill 12 slots in a cardboard box of the wines I've tasted this year. Which 12 am I walking out the door with? What's nice about that conceit is everybody can relate to that. And on top of it, it forces you to not just throw all these expensive, cellar-worthy wines that are not going to be ready for 5 to 10 years in your box. You're also going to get some stuff that will go with dinner. You're going to put some things in there that maybe are new and feel novel and have an edginess to that because it's just new territory for you. You're going to put in some things in there that maybe fit into a different kind of mindset. So it really forces me to curate a little bit better and make this digestible. So it is every year, it's a top 12 wines of the year. It's a mixed case. Within that, I do, rank them a little bit, and that's just completely done by feel. It's like once I've determined which 12 wines are in there, it's really, for me, more about constructing the article. Like, what do I want to build up to? As you read through this whole thing, it should feel like it's getting better and better and better. And so that's the storyteller in me, is like, as you get to the bottom, that number one wine is going to be really, really compelling because it was compelling to me. It's the most memorable one from the year. And usually there's a pretty clear wine in my head as to which one that is. Some years it's a toss-up between 2 or 3 of them. But as I also do this, it's also interesting as a kind of bookmark in my wine tasting career, which everybody has, to see what themes emerge with a list like this. Sometimes you walk into a wine shop and you walk out with a mixed case and you get home and you're like, God, I bought a lot of red wine. I bought a lot of sparkling, or geez, I really leaned heavily on this one region. And for me, the theme this year was really the ascendancy of white wine, which I think is a trend we're seeing globally right now. And there's a lot of sales numbers that back it up, that, what people, when they're buying wines, they're looking for something a little easier. They're looking for something lower in alcohol. They're looking for something that's got some nuance. And now we're starting to see winemakers in a lot of different regions. This is a global trend, so I'm generalizing here. But they're starting to put more research, more energy, more effort into the quality of their white wines. And so we're seeing grapes like Riesling and Sauvignon Blanc, and even Pinot Grigio. I have a Pinot Grigio on my list that really are starting to showcase terroir and technique in a way that they haven't in the past. And, for me, who's, I'm at my wine drinking career now of, 20 years I've been doing this, and 10 years I've been writing about it. I'm noticing a distinctive trend in quality with white wines. It's getting better and better and more exciting. And as that relates to like the native grapes in a place like Italy, where you've got a lot of indigenous grapes, that research that they're having is really proving beneficial. And you're starting to see them dial back on reduction heavy practices in winemaking. So in other words, stainless steel fermentation tanks, no oxygen introduced. You get a very tight, nervy wine, and they all taste the same. A lot of my guy friends are like, "Oh, white wine, it all tastes the same," and it's like, no. Like, that's because the practice has been so they've really taken the lid off of that, so to speak, to really introduce a lot of new methods. And so, the real winner this year for me was Etna Bianco, and Etna Bianco's been on the rise for a long time. This is not a new story by any means. And I got to go to Etna for a second year in a row. And just tasting around the different Etna Bianco, that was to me like that's where you're really seeing these new standards being set for white wine in terms of their expressiveness, their character, their detail, their deliciousness, their versatility. I mean, it's all right there.
Yeah. And we always say we like wine with food, and white wines to me are, really, really good and pretty flexible with food as well.
They are. I mean, I tried to curate this so it'd be like, okay, pick 5 reds, 5 whites, a rosé, and a sparkling wine, or maybe an orange wine and a sparkling wine. And this year it was like, I can't let go of these white wines. So there's 7 of them on the list, including a Pinot Noir, interestingly enough. I mean, one of the best white wines I had this year was a Blanc de Noir from Barolo. So to me, that's really what's fun about doing this project.
I will tell you, getting back to the white wine and those statistics, I'm part of that. My wife will tell you, I used to be the guy, to your point, you just made the comment, I'm not drinking a white wine. I'm a dude, give me a big bold red. But over the last couple of years, white wine's pretty much, we drink that probably 75% of the time now. I love white wine. And you've been a part of that journey. I will say to listeners, if you haven't listened to the episode you and I did, Kevin, on Etna Rosso, talking about Etna Bianco and Etna Rosso for that matter, go listen to that episode, because you will in that episode dive a little deeper about why that wine region is so great and your thoughts on it and comparing it to wine regions like Barolo and Barbaresco and things like that. So
it's up there. Etna's amazing, and it's got a lot of room to grow. But I think it's at the same time, it's arrived in many ways, which is really exciting.
Let me ask you this about your list, because, I'm thinking about, you're describing that you had these great wines, you want to go back and you're able to pick them out because they're all in this wine shop. And, I do that sometimes. I'll buy a wine and go, let me try this. And it's absolutely fantastic. And I go, I'm going back to get a couple more bottles to put in the fridge. Part of my reason for doing that is because I want to drink that bottle of wine because it was so good. The other half of the reason I do that is because I want to have some friends over and let them try this so they can experience this wine as well, because it's that good. To me, wine's always about sharing. So that's always part of my thinking process, is to go, okay, I need to share this with somebody. Somebody else needs to see how good this wine is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also, just to add on to that, there's also something to be said for a wine that's so made so well that you can enjoy it for a few nights. Yeah, you can, just have a sensible amount for one night and go, God, this is really good, but I bet it's gonna be better tomorrow night. So I'm gonna put the cork in it, put it in the fridge, bring it out, let it kind of come back up to room temperature if it's a red or whatnot. That's another criteria that I'm looking for. But I'll be honest, this is not a technical exercise. I mean, I'm not comparing technical details on the different wines to come up with the top 12. I mean, this is a feeling, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I think that's one thing that's so interesting when you compare top 10 lists or top 100 lists from the wine world to something like the year's best movies that a New York Times will put together, or Entertainment Weekly, or just any film critic. To me, that's a lot more interesting to read, as the film critics like, these are the most interesting movies of the year. There's a documentary in here that's one of them. There's a foreign film, but then there's also this blockbuster that actually said something really important about this thing that's happening in our society. And to me, that's the kind of curation we ought to get back to with wine, is because that makes it relevant. That makes it, a lot more interesting than this kind of Consumer Reports focus.
Yeah, I'll be honest and tell you I was putting some thought to it. How would I think about, the Wine Spectre wine enthusiast list? And what's curious to me, Kevin, is I've compared those lists, and, if it's a top 100 wine on one list, you would think it made the other, but a lot of times they're so different.
They are, So there's so many wines in the world too, in all fairness to them.
So I look at them like this. I look at them, and this is my approach to consuming information about wine, because I still want to get that. And opening a bottle is one of my favorite resources to go and read and learn about different, not just the wines, but the people behind them. So that's what I love about your publication as well.
Thanks, yeah.
I look at it like this, I look at Wine Spectator and Wine Enthusiast as kind of the Chick-fil-A and the Wendy's of the world. They have one recipe, no matter what restaurant you go to, it's consistent, you get the same thing. And I don't taste any kind of passion or love in that product. Where if I go to opening a bottle, I'm getting to experience the passion of Kevin Day and his efforts, his work, and really going out for us, the consumer, the readers of his publication, to be able to really appreciate the wines and the stories behind these wines, because that's one of my favorite things. If I drink a wine that I've never had before because somebody's sharing it with me, and I go, this is freaking good, then I go, who makes it? Where's it from? What's the story behind the wine? And that's what I love about, somebody like you, is I'm able to get that information, that story.
Well, thank you. I'd say the passion comes from the people I meet. And to me, the best wines come from people who aren't, business executives,
They're farmers.
They're farmers. Right.
Yeah.
I normally don't call out a single winemaker as like, a winemaker of the year. But just to kind of segue into the list, I did this year. And that's partly because for the first time, I couldn't bring myself to not list two wines from this one man who's on Mount Etna. His name is Ciro Biondi, and he is such an exceptionally skilled winemaker and such a wonderful person too. I got to know him this year, which was really a treat, because believe it or not, he had the top wine for me this year. And a few years ago, it was the top wine as well. And that was my first introduction to him, was a few years ago, where I had his Etna Rosso called San Nicolo, and was just blown away by how unpredictable and wild it felt. But I mean, it was going into terrain that I'd never seen a wine go into before.
Yeah. And
to meet his wife last year at Etna Days, taste wines with her, to say, I'm not visiting you guys this time. I don't have the time to. I'd really like to next time. This year, showing back up at Etna Days, there's Ciro. I get to meet him at the table, but we have plans to meet later. I taste his wines. They're just knockout wines. Then they send me with a group of critics to go visit Ciro Biondi. And at the tasting, he lined up his wines. He makes 2 whites. He makes an entry-level red and 2 reds. And we went through it, and I said, Ciro, if this was a poker game right now, it was like I just got dealt 4 aces. I mean, like, they're just boom, boom, boom. They were all so good and so spectacular. And as the event came to an end, I found a way to come back and visit him yet again. And that gave us a chance to walk through the vineyards and get to be a little bit more connected to like what's actually happening here. And what's so unique about Ciro's farm is that he has 3 different vineyards, and they each have their own volcanic story. Cisterna Fuori, which is this wine right here. This is on my list, is the Etna Rosso that I loved so much this year. Cisterna Fuori is kind of this volcanic basin. It's just this sandy, ashy dust bowl, basically, with these vines growing out of it. San Nicolo's across the road, and it goes up a volcanic cone. I mean, a very clear mound with these rows of vines going straight up it. And I actually got to see harvest happening there, which was really something. I mean, real heroic viticulture where people were slipping and sliding on this steep slope just to get the grapes. And then above that is Chianti, is the name of his white wine vineyard. He calls the wine Pianta because he doesn't want to confuse with Chianti Classico. It's spelled the same way, but with an A at the end. And this is that wine. This is the top wine of the year, is Pianta. So Pianta is an Etna Bianco that just really, to me, showcases where Etna Bianco is in this moment. You have so much of the talk about Etna Bianco is about how the wines on the east slope around the city of Milo, where it's really cool. They're real lean and sharp. It's like Chablis-like. these Etna Biancos. And here's Ciro on the south side of the volcano making a wine that rivals those, but has a solar character to it. So it's, the natural comparison would be the Macon, where you have like more sun and everything. However, the volcano and the acidity that you get from volcanic soil keeps this wine so honest and so pure that it kind of makes that analogy fall apart in an interesting way. So Ciro, it was really a privilege to be able to get to meet him. He's very warmly funny. He's intellectually curious. He's an architect by trade. And he went back and took over the family farm in the late 90s against his father's wishes and made something of it. And there's something to his wines that feels, once you meet him, you're like, this is making sense. This guy's really smart. He's got that kind of architect's mindset about things. And just really, it just brings Etna together in a really interesting way that I thought was really noteworthy this year. To me, that's the sign of a passionate wine, is a passionate winemaker. It's a guy like
the way you described that wine, you went from Macon and then you made me go up to like Chablis a little bit.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the comparison would be an Etna Bianco from the South Slope where it gets more sun. Is a little bit more like a Maconnais, Chardonnay. And then the ones from Milo are a little bit more like a Chablis Chardonnay. Yeah. But again, we're dealing with an indigenous grape. We're dealing with a volcano, and it's playing by its own rules at the same time. But I think sometimes we have to kind of take a step back and make those comparisons to kind of make sense of what's going on in the glass a little bit.
You bring up a good point right there when you talk about the grape of those two wines, the Etna Bianco, the Etna Rosso. What are those two grapes? People may not know that it's a different grape from that region.
Well, a lot of Etna's wines are field blends. So these vineyards oftentimes were co-planted long ago with a variety of different indigenous grapes. And sometimes you walk through a vineyard and you're not even kind of sure what you're looking at. So you'll walk by, like on the white wine side of things, the primary grape is Caricante. And they do have minimum percentages for Etna Bianco to be at least 60% Caricante. If it's from Milo and you're going to do Etna Bianco Superiore, it's got to be 80% Caricante. But there's Catarrado growing in these vineyards. There's Minella growing in these vineyards. These are probably grapes that are not super familiar to an American audience, but they're becoming more familiar because Etna Bianco is becoming more and more popular. And Caricante is kind of this paradox because it's a high-yielding grape. And usually when you hear high-yielding grape, you think it's not going to be very good. Caricante on Mount Etna, at this little elevation band where these vineyards are, does exceedingly well at giving you a good solid crop, but also preserving some of that acidity and some of that character. And on the red wine side of things, it's Nerello Mascalese is the name of the grape. You do get some Nerello Cappuccio. Not a lot of producers are dealing with Nerello Cappuccio nowadays because it's a difficult grape to deal with. It has some issues in the vineyard. It's very fickle, put it that way. But Ciro's wine, Cisternefori and San Nicolo, this wine here, has about 20% Nerello Cappuccio in there. So these are vineyards that are co-planted. Another little side story with Ciro, we're walking through his vineyard and I looked at a vine and I was like, that looks a little different. What's that? And he looks at it and just says, Cabernet. And I was like, what? And he's like, I'll tell you more about it later. And so later was hours later and he had an unmarked bottle and he poured it for me, and I was like, "This is your Cabernet, isn't it?" He goes, "Yep, make it just for myself."
Well, that's pretty cool.
That's the kind of guy Ciro is. He just does these things because he's curious.
Yeah.
And he finds a way to make it work. So, it's really about bringing those kinds of people to the mix. If you don't mind, another wine that comes to mind, and this is somebody who's really garnered quite a bit of press as well, and it's justified, is this winemaker in Chianti Classico named Angela Fronti. She is the head of the winery Estine. And I couldn't, do this top 12 this year without really thinking about February when I was in Chianti Classico at the Chianti Classico collection, tasting through 180 different wines over 2 days. A very grand tasting where, I'm amazed my teeth survived. But, at that event, and I had visited Angela before, been to her winery, and to see her trajectory and to see where her wines are going, it really felt like she's at the vanguard of where Chianti Classico is as an appellation, which is really interesting. Like, her wine has this wonderful fruitiness that also is augmented with a peppercorn savory taste. There are these botanical elements that are really interesting. And as you get familiar with Chianti Classico, you get one whiff of that and you just go, I know exactly where I am in the world, right? That is that is the magic of wine, right? The wine that I spotlighted for her is called Vigna Casanova dell'Aia, and it's a Gran Selezione. So her new release of that wine, it used to be a straight up Chianti Classico, but now as her business has grown and she's able to hold these wines back for longer, she can now designate it as the top tier in Chianti Classico as a Gran Selezione. So, again, seeing her hard work paying off in recent years, she's very modest. She's very smart. Her family has a long history in the area that dates back to the sharecropping days of Chianti Classico. It's just really neat to see these wines kind of forming in a way that makes you go, God, this is on a par with Barolo. This is on a par with Brunello di Montalcino. Like, you're seeing the rules of fine wine being rewritten as we speak in Italy right now with wines like Estine's.
Yeah. And there's a couple things I do want to mention as we're talking about your list. One is that we're going to put a link in the description of this podcast that'll take you to the article on opening the bottle so you can see the entire list and read a little bit more about, your comments on these wines. And two, a lot of times on those top 100 lists, there's half or more than half of the bottles that are $100, $200, $300 a bottle. I went through and looked at everything on your list, and for me to get these bottles, everything was $75 or less. I mean, I think you had a Bianco on there that was $20-something that, very reasonable. So I wanted to make that distinction. Very, very, as far as price, very, very affordable in my mind. Yeah.
I mean, we just finished publishing a Brunello di Montalcino report on the site. So I have a collaborator who I'm working with now, a sommelier here in Denver, who also gets to go on these trips. His name's Scott Thomas, and he went to Benvenuto Brunello. So we were struggling with that with Brunello. So we put together a list of some really great wines. But yeah, in that case, I mean, there were some wines on that list that were $250, $100. So it depends. I mean, certain regions, the prices are higher. So I'm not entirely a budget wine website, I'll say. Well, however, price is really important to me too. And I totally understand where you're coming from on that. Like, a lot of times the best wines are $30, and that's still nothing to sneeze at for a lot of people. That's an expensive wine.
Sure. And to your point on the Brunello, I mean, if you're going to focus on one region like that, it's kind of hard not to get up into some other tiers. But when you're looking at a list that you might want to go out and shop for, on that list of Brunellos, I'm sure you had some that were $70 or less.
There were. Yeah. Donatella Cinelli Colombini be a good example of a great wine, excellent value. But it wasn't a Rosso di Montalcino report. It was a Brunello di Montalcino report.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I do also want to mention, when folks go to your website, Kevin is, I don't know how I want to describe you, not professional, but an avid hobbyist when it comes to photography. So you're not just getting
professional.
Okay. All right. I'll say professional. Sometimes I say professional or expert to guests who come on the show and they go, oh, don't say that. Don't say that. But
professional no longer means you're making money.
Okay. Fair enough.
It doesn't mean like I'm making gobs of money doing it, but I have sold images before.
Okay. Because you take it very seriously. It's a passion of yours, and you're a professional, and the quality of the photos, some of the stunning sceneries that you capture are amazing. And sceneries doesn't have to be this big hillside. Sometimes it's just a village person sitting on a bench. I mean, it just captures the kind of the how that community is, or how those people are in that community, which really helps me kind of understand that area a little bit. And I love that about a lot of your photography.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for calling out the photography, because to me it's a real important part of who I am and the stories I tell is capturing those images. So if you want to see a picture of these winemakers I'm talking about, I've got photos of them. And if you want to see what this musty old cellar was that I walked into, I've got photos of them. I really want to take people there, which is kind of what I'm hoping to do in the future, is maybe adding on to opening a bottle, a tour operator business. To be totally honest, because so much of this is really sharing what these places are like, the tactile sensations of these vineyards, of the cellars where they're made. I mean, there's a lot of character there. It's a real privilege to be able to get to see that. And it is important to me to bring that part to the story.
Okay, continuing with your list, because I had 3 or 4 on there that I want to see if you're going to hit on, because they were ones that kind of caught my interest.
So, okay. Well, I mean, I don't want to necessarily go through the whole, every single wine, but I mean, just to show how wacky I can get. I mentioned a Pinot Grigio earlier. That's a Pinot Grigio from Veneca and Veneca, which is an Italian winery up in Friuli in the Collio. Great winery, has a very high reputation. And so that wine made it on the list because it tasted great in my crappy camping stemware. Like I bought this bottle while on a camping trip. We were down in Southwest Colorado. We went to Telluride in the afternoon. I wanted to wine at the campsite that night. And I was like, I had low expectations because of what I was pouring it into. I'm a plastic cup, right? Yeah. And so I took a picture of it on a Coleman stove. You'll see that in the article. Is this unconventional bottle shot of a fine Pinot Grigio. But this is a real tenacious wine. And that's the word I kind of used in my notes and put in the article, because it just didn't want to go down easy. It really wanted to like rise above, the improper stemware, didn't have the proper temperature. We were in a campsite, for God's sakes, but it was just so delicious. And I had some good friends who were there who are not wine people who, were really impressed with it. They were like, God, I've never had anything like this before. And I think the takeaway there is that this is really, it's emblematic of this moment with white wines, where you have a grape like Pinot Grigio that if you just give it the care it deserves, it can really yield great results. And in Collio, Pinot Grigio is very, very closely linked to Pinot Noir, as we know, and they give it the attention that they would give Pinot Noir, and you get a wine that's of high quality. So, it's trying to put things in there like that are kind of narrative driven, that I think kind of makes it interesting.
So let me ask you this question, Kevin. If we're talking about Pinot Grigio and we know it's a grape in Italy, would you say that if you can't find this wine specifically, the quality level of Pinot Grigio is going to be, found in Friuli or in Alto Adige? Is that the two regions you would suggest? Or is there some other regions?
Probably be more specific with Friuli. What you want to look for is Collio.
Okay.
Yeah, because Friuli has a lot of low-lying vineyards as well, like Veneto does, that will be making some bulk wine. The real litmus test for Pinot Grigio is the color. If it looks watery, thin, pass. Yeah. If it's in a clear bottle, pass. So the Veneca Pinot Grigio is a darker color. They make wines there that they call Ramato, which are almost like an orange wine, because Pinot Gris is a gray grape. If you leave it on the skins for long enough and macerate it, you're going to get some color, and it's going to veer almost into like a rosé kind of hue. It's kind of coppery colored. And so those are the wines that are going to like have quite a bit of expression to them. They still need to have balance. You can't just leave it on the skins and voila, you've got a great wine. You still need really good winemaking. But really, Collio has really set a high standard for that. I would say Alto Adige has too. Alto Adige, they're so technical and so like just maniacal in the level of attention of detail in Alto Adige, which kind of comes from the Austrian tradition, that a lot of the Pinot Grigios that are coming from there are also quite good, and really defy the trend. But as a whole, Pinot Grigio is maligned for good reason. It's really... it's a filler, it's bulk wine. Oftentimes it's thin, it's lemon water. I've heard it all, but I think
Santa
nonetheless,
Margarita.
Yeah, right. So I to me, I'm a contrarian. So I was like, yeah, I'll put a Pinot Grigio on my list because it was damn good. It was tenacious. So,
well, I've had that exact wine, different vintage. I had the 2021. I think yours, if I'm remembering, was the 2022, but
yeah, it was. And, I come up with little names for every one of these wines. It's like I'm assembling a squad. So I referred to that one as the Refuter Part 1.
I like that.
The one right after that was the Refuter Part 2, which was a Rioja Blanco from Spain, just because I'd not really had great luck with that grape before, which is Viura. And just really kind of felt like, again, it's like Pinot Grigio, like this is a grape that they put in Cava. It's the same as Macabeo. But it's just, I've never really had anything that said anything of any interest. And Luberi's Zuri Rioja Blanco is the name of the wine, the 2022. God, it was so amazing. It was partly because they left it on the lees for a long time. So it had all like that kind of nutty quality to it. It was a really interesting grape. So yeah, the list I'm trying to also come up with, just as you look at the navigation on the side where you can kind of jump to any of the 12 wines, it's meant to kind of tease you into like what the category might be. So
I don't know if it's on your list, but I was wanting to get you to talk about the devil's wine.
Yeah, the brisk weather red is how I referred to it. Yeah, so this is a wine I've had before, and I revisited it for the first time in 5 years. So this is an Italian wine from a winemaker named Danilo Tomain, and he is up in Valdosta, and it's called Enfer d'Arvier. And so it's a French name because this region is very closely aligned culturally with France. So we're basically underneath Mont Blanc in the Alps, way up there. And there's this tiny little amphitheater along the river that is known as the Inferno of Arvier. There's a little town there called Arvier. And Danilo Tomain is the only estate bottle producer there. The rest of it goes to a cooperative. And he makes this wine that is sensational in terms of its smokiness. It's just sharp berry fruit. Alpine wines have a real distinct character to them, especially on the fruit side of things. It's always going to veer a lot more like cranberry, tart, pomegranate kind of flavors versus, big bold cherries or kind of, plums. It always kind of has this like sharpness to it. And this wine really did that beautifully, but it just is so evocative and so interesting. I mean, it's the kind of wine that you could have in the middle of summer and you're like, oh shoot, I should have had this in autumn. It would have matched the mood perfectly,
Yeah.
So that's a real interesting wine. And so, yeah, it's the Hell of Arvier is kind of the name of the vineyard. And so you can tell your friends when you have that wine that, we're having a bottle of hell tonight, and
well,
it's got a very punk rock, kind of label on it.
I was going to say that too. Yeah. I love the label.
Yeah. It looks a little bit like it's a natural wine, but I mean, it's imported by Rosenthal Wine Merchant, which is a very good wine importer.
Absolutely.
And they do prefer those smaller producers following more natural methods, but I'm off the top of my head, I'm not familiar with, sulfur use in this wine, but this wine, really did not have any flaws or any kind of funkiness to it, anything like that. It's a really precise, fine wine.
Yeah. When you described it, it sounded delicious, but then, reading the name of it and the description for the wine from hell. And then, ultimately I'm not a label guy, but seeing that label, when you have that description, that quality of wine that you're talking about, and you have a cool label, it just kind of intrigues me a little more.
I mean, I honestly, I only know about that wine because I'd read about this during the Wine Scholar Guild days when I was researching. I'm such a geek for heroic viticulture, where you have these impossible vineyards that are somehow defying gravity and they're making wine out of it. And this is really one of them.
Yeah.
So I wanted to revisit it for that reason. I mean, normally I'd look at that label and I'd pass it on it. Just being honest.
Just looking at the label, I probably would too, but it was after reading the story and seeing the label that I went, okay, this is pretty cool.
Yeah. That's the number 10 wine on the list. The Pinot Grigio I was talking about earlier was number 12. Another one that kind of comes to mind, I mentioned this earlier, is this, this Vino Bianco from Cavallotto called Pinner. And that's a Pinot Noir, a Blanc de Noir, which is real interesting, which I think when you hear that, you kind of think, well, that's a still white wine made from Pinot Noir. What the heck is that going to taste like? But we actually taste this all the time when we taste champagne, when you're really thinking about it. And the story here is that this was actually a Pinot Noir clone that was taken from Champagne in 1972 and planted in one of the Barolo Cru vineyards in the days before the madness for Barolo Cru. And so even though this is Nebbiolo territory, and even though Cavallotto is one of the great Barolo producers, this is their answer for a white wine. And it's always really interesting when you go to Piedmont, how different all these different Barolo producers are with their white wine. Not all of them have a white wine, but some people, it's like we went all in on Riesling. Okay. Some are like, we went all in on Chardonnay. Okay. Increasingly, you're seeing people go all in on Timorasso, a native grape that's real interesting. Mm-hmm. There's Nashetta, there's Arnaz. There's all these white wines. And they're always trying to kind of find, what's going to be that statement white wine that complements, the Barolos, the big, towering, magnificent wines. And, it's kind of that desire to be like Burgundy, right? Where you've got Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, you've got, great estates making both red and white. And here's a Pinot Noir that's a white. It's such an amazing wine. It's really textural, really expressive. You can really kind of just feel like the silkiness of it is really a hallmark probably of the soil, I'm guessing.
And this was another one that, from the way you describe it, it makes me think it really punches up, because when I looked it up and I found a price for it, again, I think this was mid-20s, something like that. It wasn't expensive. And I went, okay, going on my list. And as I mentioned that, and I talk about, some of these that I'm going to search out and try to find, how would you suggest or recommend to the listeners if they want to, they go to your website, they look at this list, they make their own list of these because they want to try them. How should they shop for these?
Well, first of all, I think it's always good to have a local wine shop that you're loyal to, that you have a relationship with. Yeah. And support your local businesses first and foremost. And I think, you probably, a lot of your listeners have a wine shop that they're immediately thinking of, and they probably have an employee who works there who they knows this sort of stuff, that they like to take the list to them, is what I'd say.
Because a lot of times, if you don't see it there, ask. They can.
Right.
They might
be able to order it for one, or more likely they'll be able to say, "Oh, I see why you're curious about this. I don't have that right now, but here's something else." Yep. There's a good chance that Kevin Day hasn't tasted that, and you got a leg up on me.
Yeah.
But that's really where I would start, for one. However, I would also say, Wine Searcher is a great way to locate where some of these bottles are being sold online. And a lot of wine lovers that I work with, people whose cellars I consult on, they do a mixture of both. They like their local wine shop, they support them, but man, when they gotta have it, they may be ordering it from a wine shop out of New York and having it shipped. It all depends on your state and the local laws that you have. I know some states are very, very restrictive in that regard, but that's kind of what I would do. And I think there's a few really solid wine shops out of New York that often have these types of wines. I'm thinking of Flatiron, I'm thinking of Astor, I'm thinking of a few others. So, ordering from them, Verve, that'd be another one.
Saratoga wines, I get a lot from.
Yep, Saratoga wines. You develop, what your list is of those merchants who will have this kind of stuff, and just be on the lookout. I mean, again, the it's not so much about the exact wine in this list; it's also about the producers. And just being aware of those producers. I mean, Veneca is very well known amongst people who are fans of Italian wine. Gidi Vera, who's number 2 on my list for their Barolo, fantastic winery. Everybody knows about Gidi Vera, and for good reason.
Sure.
And there's a few others on the list too that are kind of qualified for that. So you'll be able to find those producers. Maybe not that exact wine, maybe not that exact vintage, but I'd highly encourage, thumbs up to any of these producers, because I tasted a lot of wines last year, and that didn't come anywhere close to this list too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, do you have another one or two that you want to talk about?
If we still have listeners, I don't know.
Absolutely. Because if you don't mention anything, I'm gonna bring it up to you. So go ahead.
Well, I think the last one that I did want to point out is Tessa Larsdal. So this is, again, here I am, an Italian wine specialist, focused on France, focused on wines of Europe. And then I got an opportunity midsummer when a South African winemaker came to town. I was invited to meet her, and her story was so interesting. I was like, I do want to meet her. This sounds really pretty cool. Her name is Barine Sals, and she is the first South African first South African winery owner with slave heritage. So she traced her whole lineage back. She was very eloquent about talking about her story, and she was really more of a beer drinker when she started working in the wine industry. She started working at Hamilton Russell Vineyards many years ago, and really came to love the job, love the business, really worked her way up. She became the export manager. She still manages exports for them, but she basically had done every job within this winery, from being a cellar rat to being in the vineyard to being in distribution to being in marketing. And they got to a point where they said, Barine, we've seen you work so hard here, and what we would like to do is extend an opportunity to you to make your own wine, because there really isn't any job you haven't done here yet, and we'd like to finance that to start. And so she had this opportunity fall in her lap, and I remember asking her, well, what was your reaction when they gave you this news? And she's just like, I was immediately focused on what I was going to do. Like she's like, I'm a little bit of a soldier. That's what she told me.
Awesome.
My mentality when I work is I'm a soldier. And so I just was like, this is such an awesome opportunity, and I cannot let them down and blow it. I'm just going to do everything I can in my power. So again, we go back to that word tenacious, right? Barine is really tenacious to be able to pull this off. And she makes a Chardonnay that is just gorgeous. I mean, lights out, beautiful Chardonnay, one of the best Chardonnay I've had ever. And what's so unique about it is you can really taste the tension that I think has to be going on in the vineyard. It's a cool climate Chardonnay. This is not something you can just manufacture through cellar technique or anything like that. It's just this really pure, nice, lean edge to it. It was just a wine that really just made me perk up and go, wow, there's some really cool things happening worldwide that I'm too focused and specialized in my one little area. And it just kind of gave me a little bit of a shot of hope. It was a little bit like I want to keep doing what I'm doing because of people like her.
Well, I think that's a great story, and another bottle on my list because it caught my eye because when you go through your list, folks will see this. You had the South African flag kind of there as an identifier that it was.
Wait a second.
Yeah. But I do want to finish up, if you're all right with doing this. One more wine that was on your list that caught my eye coming from you. And you kind of mentioned it in areas that you go to in a place that kind of keeps calling you back to come back and evaluate their wines. That's the Riesling on your list.
Yeah. Yeah. Which the name I gave that one was just the classic.
Yeah.
No, I'm a big Riesling fan. And, it's kind of a joke amongst the wine writers that I meet on these trips that I go on when we're all together that we all care about Riesling. We just wish that our readers did.
Yeah.
Because, if you want to spend a lot of time on an article and be disappointed by the web traffic, write about Riesling, because people just have not gotten the memo about this grape and what it's capable of.
Yeah.
So this wine here, it's number 8. It's from Weinhof Meisterei. The winemaker here is Matthias Herzberger. And I got this wine when I was gathering a bunch of samples for a first taste guide to Wachau Riesling. I really wanted to dive into Austria's wines with my first taste guide series and really thought I'd start with the big dog, which is Wachau. And as I kind of did my research, I kind of came to, realize that Wachau has gone through a lot of changes, in part because of climate change. It's a region that has long named its wines based on alcohol strength. So when you see Smaragd at the end of it, which is Smaragd, that means it's a high alcohol Riesling. Federspiel is going to be a little lighter. So I was trying to gather different levels of alcohol, different Rieslings. I also did another guide on Gruner Veltliner from Wachau. And it was a bit of a confusing project, to be totally honest with you, because there's so many different styles coming from this place. And then along came this wine and a second one from this producer. This is the Ried Kolmitz, and then there was the Ried Bach. And this was, high elevation, perched up on a windy ridge way above the river, and another one that was low down, closer to the river where it's warm. And the terroir differences were very, very noticeable. I tasted them side by side. This is really what's so interesting about Riesling is it always has these different dials that turn. You're going to get apple, stone fruit kind of flavors. The acidity is going to be very lime-like in its sensation. You might get some flowers, you might get some herbs. And it was just interesting to see how these two wines compared in terms of how intense those different, dials were. But this is just really a super refined, very age-worthy, very textural Riesling wine that I just felt like it was the best Austrian wine of the year that I had, and that's why I included it.
Yeah, I'm glad that you did. And I bring up Riesling because anytime I see it on a list, it catches my eye. I get what you're saying, but the more we can talk about it, the more we can kind of, hey, Kevin, I'll just say it, put it right in everybody's face or shove it down their throat, if you will. Maybe they'll start to go, you know what, maybe I need to give this a little more attention because Riesling, it rivals what people think should be the king of the white wine, right? I mean, it's up there.
It goes back a little bit to what we were saying earlier about like white wines being, kind of boring and vanilla and people just think they all taste the same. I think if that's your metric is a white wine that is really reductive, so it really feels tight, very acidic and anonymous, and then you have a Riesling from one of these regions, it's like you're not even having a white wine. It's so powerful, it's so intense, it's so detailed. And so I think sometimes people who maybe dog on Riesling just don't know what to think of it, don't know what to do with it. And that's totally fine, right? But I will tell you, Riesling consistently comes from some of the most insane places on earth for winemaking. All I have to do is look at videos of how they do harvest in the Mosel River in Germany, how they do harvest in the Wachau. This particular one, this Ried Kolmitz that I have listed on my site, this Riesling, is usually not harvested until November, the first week in November, because of the conditions in the vineyard. It's very steep. It takes forever for the grapes to ripen. They have to wait. And so they're really threading this needle of like, gee, I hope we don't get a frost and lose everything in that vineyard.
That's a good point.
I think when you start studying Riesling, you start meeting people who make Riesling. I mean, you can't help but tip your cap to what they go through to produce that wine. And again, we're not talking about a $200 wine here. You know, the amount of labor and effort that's going into these kinds of wines would definitely justify that kind of cost. The market just doesn't bear it out. So it's, you know, as a wine lover who's cost conscious, we're the winners. So
absolutely. Well, the other thing I would say is, you know, people who drink Riesling, to your point you made earlier, they kind of give you that identifier on the bottle with alcohol in this area. But a lot of times there's names that give you some indication of style of Riesling you're getting, mostly related, I think, you tell me, you're the expert, related to the sweetness level sometimes, you know, a Cabernet versus a Spatzlese, things like that.
Yeah, that'd be a German distinction. And that's the thing with Wachau that's so controversial right now, is they've long hung their hat on alcohol strength, and they're the only ones who do that.
Okay.
You go to other Austrian regions, and they're not doing that. This is actually a trademark of Vinea Wachau, which is the local wine consortium of bottlers. And so they've now moved away from that into an appellation-based system that's kind of in line with the other wine regions of Austria. And so there are some producers who are like, I'm leaving Vinea Wachau to really be more in line with the rest of Austria, because that's really the shift we need to make. And then there's other producers like Matthias Herzberger, who's behind Weinhof Meisterei, who's like, no, there's still validity in doing the Federspiel and the Smaragd and the alcohol level labeling. You know, of course, alcohol is published right on the label for us anyways.
Sure.
Right? So we don't really need another word to memorize to tell us that. But it's just part of the tradition of that area. And it's, for me, it's not, you know, when I wrote my guide, it was not my place to say, here's where they're right or wrong. It was to get their two different opinions and put that in the guide, you know?
Sure.
So yeah, it's interesting. You're right. A lot of times with Riesling, some of the nomenclature is more focused on sweetness.
Yeah, because you can get so many styles of Riesling. You know, you may have one you don't like, but that doesn't mean there's not one out there you will absolutely love.
Yeah. And I think a tip for consumers is to look at the alcohol level. If it's 12% or higher, it's going to be dry.
Yep.
Most certainly. I mean, it might be a little off dry at 12%. Depends on the region, depends on the climate. You know, if you get a 14% Riesling, there's not going to be any sweetness there. It's all been gobbled up by the yeast and turned into alcohol. So
hey, but you know, there's some styles of food where, you know, a 7.5% or 8% alcohol, it's a really nice Riesling to have with that food.
My parents love drinking really sweet Riesling because they're like, we drink a lot of it. It's only 7% alcohol.
Yeah.
It's like,
that
I
bottle
can't believe
gets
it's
finished.
not butter.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, as always, man, this has been a lot of fun. And like I said earlier, we're going to put the link to this this article in the description of the podcast. We'll also put a link just to your website. But let the folks know where they can find you. Obviously, they're going to have the website, but you're on social media as well. Let them know they can find you and follow you there as well, especially when we talk about photography.
Yeah, at Opening a Bottle. That's where I'm at. I'm mostly on Instagram. I'm no longer on Twitter. Can't bring myself to call it X. I'm on Facebook as well at Opening a Bottle, and I do updates there. I'll just promote articles. You know, if you go to my site, you know, if it does have a paywall, so if you click on more than one free article, it will ask you to opt in for the newsletter. If you do that within a month, you know, it's really just to encourage the growth of the site because I need subscribers to do what I do. It's really the only way. I don't have ads on the site, so it's either I give you a little nag to join my email newsletter, or I put ads on there which blink at you. So pick your poison, but that's the nature of the business. But yeah, openingabottle.com is the publication. I'm really excited because next month I'm going to be going to Piedmont, where I'll be able to go to Nebbiolo Prima. I'll be tasting all sorts of different Barolo, Barbaresco, Roero wines, and visiting some really benchmark producers as well, and for research on a book that I'm publishing next year, which maybe could be another podcast.
Yeah.
And then in February, I'm going to Anteprima di Toscana to report again on Chianti Classico and some other Tuscan wine regions. So being able to do these annual reports on Italian wines really becoming a good central focus of the site. and then everything that kind of complements it and surrounds it. So good things are happening.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again for coming on, man. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you.
Absolutely go check out Opening a Bottle and look at this list. And by the way, make your own list. You know, this is inspiration. You mentioned this, Kevin, earlier, to make your own list. Go back in your year, your wine journey this year, and really think about, you know, what you've drank. And I know we said we wanted to talk about that because I think that's a great point to be able to evaluate where you are in your journey, what you like, what you don't like, and what producers you like, what grapes you like, what regions you like, just to kind of, you said it earlier, to become kind of that expert.
Yeah, that's the only reason you're doing this. It's so you can drink better. It's not so I can drink better or somebody else can be more impressed that you read somebody's list, right? It's to inspire you to be a better drinker for yourself. So
absolutely. Well, thanks again. As always, have a great time doing this with you.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Rob. Take care. Happy New Year.
Thanks, everybody, for listening to this episode of Food, Wine, and Whiskey. And until our next episode, enjoy your